We saw lots of funnies in the number. The unbundling from Mondi's just over a year ago, so it's probably more interesting to look at revenue and operating profit. So a good number, but we know traditionally the first half is more difficult for MPACT.
That's correct, Erika. I mean, the first half is probably characterized by some negatives and some positives. On the negative side, we've seen consumer demand under pressure, consumer spending under pressure in our business. Coupled with that, then you've got serious competition in the market, where people are highly competitive under those circumstances, and that's put pressure on margins to some extent. So that's on the difficult side. On the positive side, we've had some things to be grateful for. In the first instance, we've seen fruit exports from South Africa in the first half up, and we are a big supplier to the fruit industry for export product, and that's high quality, good graphic boxes, because those essentially display the brands on the shelves in the supermarkets overseas, and that we believe the fruit exports are probably up in excess of 5%. That's a positive. Coupled with that, of course, you've got the weakening of the rand, which is 15% weaker in the first half of this year versus last year, and that's helped us to claw back some of our market share in terms of import replacement on the paper packaging side, and that's been good for us. And then finally, I suppose we've had 4 years of tough market conditions, and so we've managed to build a business in those conditions, and we'll continue to do so.
But you're saying you've got the muscles, you can deal with this, so whatever the market throws at you. But let me just ask you about that. You referred now to imported competition. So that's one of the hassles we keep hearing from all the manufacturers who come and talk to us about their results. Is that and rising costs? How are you managing and handling the rising costs?
Look, the rising costs are a concern. If you take across the board, you've got, for example, transport, electricity and labour, I think, are the key themes in our business. And it is quite difficult to recover your margins, and get prices at the levels that are required. But having said that, we're fortunate to see our volumes grow just short of 7% overall in our business over the past year for some of the reasons that I mentioned to you just now, and some of the developments in our plastics business where we've made significant progress over the last year. So despite the difficult circumstances, we've got a lot to be grateful for.
What sort of pricing power do you have, if you've said it's so competitive locally, just amongst yourselves and also with imported competition?
Well, I mean, let's take in the paper business. We integrated, to give you an example, from waste paper collection right through to corrugated box production. So 45% of all waste paper collected in South Africa is processed by us into new boxes, and we have an extensive network in South Africa collecting waste paper. So we are by far the biggest recycler in South Africa, and that gives us an opportunity, one, to make sure we can manage the costs into our business, because waste paper is obviously a big cost driver, and also security of supply. I mean, one big thing in waste paper is security of supply. That's a benefit, and then we capture the margins throughout that chain. So that's one area where we've got, I think, a good advantage. Coupled with that, we are the biggest corrugated producer in South Africa by a significant margin, also in terms of the top-end products, high-value products. And those obviously are people that are packaging fruit, for example, are concerned about making sure their fruit arrives at the destination, first of all intact and displaying the brand suitably. And for that, you don't want to save a cent on your packaging. It doesn't mean that we can't be cost competitive. We've got to be cost competitive, but quality counts a lot, and we focused on that in the past, and we'll continue to do so going forward.
You talk about being big in corrugated packaging. As you number one, if you look at the list, I think 4 or 5 items in the South African market, you're the top producer there. Plastics, I'd imagine, is where the future above GDP growth is going to come for the business. It's now a quarter of revenue, probably expecting much more.
Well, you could see in rigid plastic specifically, we believe the growth rates are probably going to exceed 5%. They did exceed 5% in the past 5-10 years. And that's driven by substitution to a large extent from different substrates. So you're
not going to mention what?
Yeah, well, I mean, a glass, and I'm not suggesting there's no place for glass. There is a place for glass. But you'd see, for example, today, a number of products that were in glass 5 years ago are in PET. The technology is changing in polyethylene terephthalate, which is a plastic raw material.
You're making wine bottles, I believe.
We make wine bottles, yes. That's quite a small part of the business, but I mean, it shows you what can be done. 10 years ago, probably unthinkable to see wine in PET. Today it's there, and that just shows how the technology has developed over the past years.
Well, Bruce, we've got Byron Lott in the studio. He's from Vestact, a company analyst, and I'm sure he's got a question or two for you.
Yes, Bruce. Other than currency fluctuations, packaging companies normally grow in line with GDP. As a potential investor, what kind of excitement would you be offering in terms of growth above GDP levels? I know you talk about recycling, and it did come up in your financial reports, but please elaborate a bit more in detail, with that kind of sustainable growth and looking at a bit of a green theme.
Well, let's just for a start look at where the growth comes from, underlying growth in an economy in packaging. You'd expect packaging growth to at least mirror to some extent consumption, consumer spending, provided of course that consumer spending is supported by local manufacturing. So with that in place, what you say is correct. I mean, you're mirroring some element of GDP. There are the elements of migration from one packaging substrate to another, which one has to bear in mind when one looks at growth per different sector. So let's take, for example, as I mentioned, rigid plastics growing well in excess of GDP over the past 5 years, and there's probably no reason to believe that it won't continue to grow like that. Paper is mature in many respects, but there are lots of factors which influence the growth going forward. For example, paper has got a good returnable cycle already, you know. So in South Africa, we're seeing recycling rates of just short of 60% in paper, which is good. So the green story is there, you know, and I think it's there across packaging. I mean, packaging recycling is improving and getting a lot more focus than what it's had in the past. As I mentioned, we're a big recycler in South Africa. That brings with it many benefits in terms of raw material supply, but also just the whole sustainability issue is important in that regard. Looking at growth beyond South Africa, bear in mind that everything you consume, other than your tap water perhaps, is packaged in one form or another. And if you look beyond our own borders to the potential in the rest of Africa, I suppose there's a massive opportunity for the increasing consumption of packaging, which might suggest that packaging in some of those countries might grow beyond what you see.
And how are you tapping into those opportunities? I mean, is that where, you know, top line growth is going to come from?
Well, we'd be cautious to put too much emphasis on the potential. There's no doubt there's potential, but there's a lot that lies between the dream and the reality for us, you know. So we've got modest ambitions outside South Africa, but we do have ambitions. So we'd be looking to tap some of those opportunities, but we'll do it in a cautious way. There's no doubt.
You're being very diplomatic, and you're not giving us any countries or any
cautious
details
on Africa, but you do have some presence in Africa.
Yeah, look, as things are today, 10% of our revenue, for example, in 2011, just slightly less than 10%, excuse me, was derived from sales into the rest of Africa. Bear in mind, South Africa is also Africa. We mustn't forget. 10% into the rest of. Plus, we've got plants in Namibia, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique, which we've had for some time. We've been trading in Africa for the last 25 years, nothing new. But when it comes to manufacturing, I think there are a lot of things that we'd have to learn, and we don't for 1 minute think it would be easy. And while we have ambitions, I think they're modest at this point.
Well, Bruce, thank you so much for joining us today. Bruce Strong, the CEO of MPACT.